Okay, class, so we've done an overview of what it means to annotate, and we've previewed the steps and also the guides on the markings. But again, it's kind of hard to understand when you just see it laid out in steps and charts. So we're going to put it into practice. There's going to be two different practices I'm going to model for you. This one is going to be the fiction practice, and I'm going to make another video for the nonfiction, which is an informational piece. So again, we're just going to kind of go through this. I'm going to read it to you and then show you some of the markings that I made based off my own thinking and also some that my students came up with last year. So let's get started. So again, this is a fictional practice. So when you look at your guide, you're going to want to use the fiction part of it. So the steps to annotating say that the first thing we need to do is preview. So we need to skim effectively and notate any eye-catching text or images. So let's look at the title. The title says The Early Deaths of Lubeck, Brennan, Harp, and Carr. This is also an excerpt by Jesse Ball. So an excerpt means that it's part of a bigger piece. So we're probably not going to see the whole story in this little piece of text. This is just a little piece taken out from the whole. The other thing that I kind of notice is that it says the early deaths of Lubeck, Brennan, Harp, and Carr. Well, when I think of early deaths, that must mean that these people are going to be young. And the deaths are probably going to be unexpected, right? Because if it's early, you're not really expecting it. We don't know if the writer is a female or male, so that we really can't say anything about. So the question is, are we going to see these deaths in this piece of text or are we not? It's kind of something just to keep in the back of our heads. So then it says chunk. Break big text into smaller pieces. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, there are two paragraphs here, but one is really long and kind of dense. It has a lot going on in it. So I actually broke the second paragraph into two pieces, 2A and 2B, and we'll go over each one of them. So remember, you chunk it the way that you need to. You will number the paragraphs, right, because that was one of the things that you needed to do, but the way you chunk it, that's up to you. What is manageable for you? Right? I can read long pieces of text at a time, and that's not a problem. But then, like my brother, he prefers to only do a couple sentences at a time. So it's whatever works for you. So before we get to reread, we actually have to read the text, right? So I'm going to read this to you with no stops. Just kind of listen to as I'm reading it and see if you pick up on anything. He lay in bed. He could smell the morning where it was around him. A dog was barking somewhere in the building. A wind was blowing, and the house creaked. Doors locked shut strained to be wall, but they might never be. In a moment he had risen and passed out of the room. He did not permit himself to look at it before he left. Carr was early. He was outside. It was cold. It was early to have gone outside. There were trees that lined the street. Each had been allotted an area of stone and earth. More than 100 years ago it might have been, for now the tree roots up and down the avenue stretched and crouched and broke the surrounding stone. The trees rose to make a tunnel in the street in summer. In winter, the fingers met in the air all along, winding around each other. He felt the permanence of the street, of the town, the permanence of the trees. The wind came up again and turned him, pushed him half a step. He looked away from the wind. The sky was brightening. The wind blew harder and harder. He turned up his collar and sheltered against the house. So there's a lot going on in this text, but right now we're kind of on surface level. We don't know what's going on. So that's when the rereading comes in handy, and that's when you use your annotation guide to create some notes. So I'm actually going to show you the notes that I created. I'm going to break it down, so we're going to do it in chunks. So the first paragraph is this short one right here. So paragraph 1. This is what it would look like without any annotations. Notice I did leave room. This is going to be important because when you do your practice, you're going to see a lot of room around and in between so that you have a lot of room for your annotations. But this is what my annotations look like. It's not always pretty, okay? So I numbered it, paragraph 1, and already I have a question. He lay in bed. Who is he? So technically I should have drawn an arrow right here, but I do know that I am asking, who is he? He could smell the morning where it was around him. So this does not indicate the smells are from in his own house or outside of it. And then when I started thinking about what is the smell of morning smell like, well, for me, that smell is chorizo and eggs and tortillas. When my grandmother was cooking and I was younger, she made it every morning with some, refried beans, and it was just very warm. So I would think of maybe some food smells, right? That's what breakfast normally is your foods, and then you're smelling it throughout the house. And then sometimes maybe you smell the outside if there's windows open. But for right now, for me, my connection was chorizo, eggs, and tortillas. A dog was barking somewhere in the building. So somewhere in the building indicates to me that this dog is not his dog, right? And then a building, okay, so he's not living in a home, like a house. He's not just in a room. He's in a building. So maybe it's an apartment. Okay, the house may be an old house converted into apartments, right? And I'll show you where I get this idea. A wind was blowing and the house creaked. So wait a minute. A minute ago, he said the building, but now he's saying a house. So, okay, maybe he's not living in a house with like his family where he's just in a room, but that's why I was thinking maybe it's one of those old houses that has been converted into an apartment. So that's why I added that note there. Doors locked shut, strained to be wall, but they might never be. So here's where I find my literary device, personification, right? Because doors can't strain to be anything. They're not human. So that's personification. And then it says, but they might never be. So let's think about this. When doors are locked, who can come in? Nobody. But that's not good enough. They don't want to just keep people out occasionally, right? Because you can always unlock a door and somebody can come in. It's kind of saying that they want to be wall where nobody can ever come in. So that's why I put the note here. Doors want to be walls. No one can enter, keeps people out. And it's also saying that there's still a chance, though. That word might. It's not saying they're never going to be a wall, but maybe they will be. But that takes some effort of the humankind. So that's kind of in my head as well. In a moment, he had risen and passed out of the room. So in a moment indicates that it's not like he dragged his feet getting out of bed. I don't know about you, but Miss Garcia has a really, really hard time getting out of bed. So I lay there and then I kind of get up and then I stumble to the bathroom and I'm like, blah. No, this kind of indicates that he got up and he moved through that room quickly. And notice the room, it's not giving us any real details about the room. We don't know anything about it. So we don't know if it's a big room. We don't know if it's a little room. We just know that he passed through it. He did not permit himself to look at it before he left. Okay, so this is where I start to have a question, right? What is it? And why is he avoiding it? Again, it would be easier if I had drawn arrows, but sometimes you won't. But I would like to see arrows. And it makes me think he did not permit himself to look at it before he left. Well, let me draw a connection from my own experience. When I do that, that means I'm avoiding something. And that makes me wonder, what is he avoiding? Because the things I tend to avoid are items that make me sad. Or I don't want to deal with. So obviously he doesn't want to deal with something, but the text isn't saying that directly, but it's something I can connect to as somebody that has experienced that. So think about it. What connection can you make? If you're avoiding looking at something, what would cause you to do that? Okay, and the other question is, who is he, right? I still don't know who he is. The title listed all these names, but I don't know who this guy is. So that's another question. But I think I've gotten everything I can out of this one paragraph. And that's actually a lot of information, right? There's a lot of questions and a lot of things. So then I'm going to hashtag it and summarize it. So someone has woken up and is avoiding something. Pretty simple, right? Use my own words, and it's not too deep. It's just, this is what it's about. So let's look over here at our steps for annotating. So review. Do my symbols and notes make sense? Are they in my own words? I would say yes. The only thing that might cause me some issues is I really didn't draw arrows from my question marks, and that might be helpful in the future, like if I'm trying to go back after a long text. So maybe that's something I would fix. Now I'm going to repeat it, right? I'm done with this paragraph. Paragraph 1, check. So now we're going to move on. So remember I told you that I broke up the second paragraph into 2 sections. And I'm going to show you why. Because they're actually pretty long and they're really dense with content. And so we really want to dig into it. So it's okay to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to look at my annotations just so you can see. So here you go. So here's 2A, and I'm going to walk you through it. So car was early. Okay, car, question mark. So is that the answer to one of my questions? Is that he? That's who he is car? I guess we'll find out. So car was early. He was outside. It was cold. It was early to have gone outside. Well, here's where I do see diction. Okay, remember diction is words, words, words. And notice how the sentences are very short. Car was early. He was outside. It was cold. It was early to have gone outside. Even that last sentence is kind of confusing. It's worded kind of weird. And so to me, because of the diction, the short sentences that get longer kind of indicates to me how the brain works in the morning. I don't know about you, but I don't wake up thinking these long, grand thoughts and sentences. In the morning, I'm like, oh, I'm tired. I don't want to go to work. I want to go back to bed. But as I start to wake up, my thoughts get a little bit longer, right? So to me, the diction is kind of trying to reinforce that he's not fully awake when he goes outside, but he's starting to wake up. Also, it indicates that it was cold. So to me, is that winter, fall maybe? Again, I don't know where he lives. I don't know if this is up north. I don't know if this is in the south. But normally in the south, it doesn't truly get cold until winter. But in the north, it kind of gets cold in the fall. So it could be one of those. And then it repeats outside twice. So it's really trying to indicate to me, because remember, repetition is trying to call attention to something. So it's trying to make sure you know he is no longer inside. He is outside. So remember in the first paragraph, it's almost like he wanted to be shut in, but he was also avoiding something. So now he's outside, he's away from that. So maybe we can draw some connections there. So he's also exposed. And so see, here I put repetition. I indicate with arrows where that literary device is, and then I use my arrow to say he's no longer inside, he's exposed. There are trees that line the street. Okay, I can see that in my head. Technically, I could have put that that's imagery. Each had been allotted an area of stoned-in earth. So for me, this was an easy image for me to see in my head because I've traveled a lot, and I've seen these types of sidewalks where they have every little section has its own tree, and it's kind of bricked in. But a lot of my students over the past couple of years, they didn't know what that meant. So they, didn't know what allotted means. And so I drew a picture. So each tree has its own little space of dirt, and around it, it's kind of bricked in. We've seen it on TV. And each one it's kind of equally spaced throughout the street. So allotted would mean that it has its own space, right? It's kind of parsed out. It's pieced out. More than 100 years ago, it must have been, for now the tree's roots up and down the avenue stretched and crouched and broke the surrounding stone. Okay, so there's a lot in just this one sentence. So more than 100 years ago, that means those are some pretty old trees. I mean, pretty old. It must have been, so he's not sure, but he knows it's at least 100 years old. And then we also get further indication that they're old trees because the roots are now breaking through the ground. Have you ever seen old trees where the roots kind of reach up through the ground and the sidewalk and it breaks everything because they keep growing and growing. It doesn't care that there's concrete there. That's kind of the idea. So that's also imagery. And it's also kind of the idea that these trees cannot be contained. They're growing and they're old and there's nothing that's going to stop them from continuing to grow. But then we also have personification because it says that the roots are stretching and crouched and broke. Well, those are human characteristics, right? We all stretch, we crouch, we kind of like, ugh. So that's personification. So now we know he's outside and he's surrounded by very old trees and it's cold. The trees rose to make a tunnel in the street in summer. So that's definitely imagery. If you've never seen it in person, it's actually very beautiful when the trees get really big and green and they make a tunnel over the street. It's like really awesome. But even if you haven't seen it in person, a lot of us have seen it in like paintings or on the TV. So we know what that looks like. So that would be imagery because it's trying to really bring home this image of these trees. And the question is, why are these trees even important? So in winter, the fingers met in the air all along, winding about each other. Well, again, there we go, personification, because it's talking about the branches as fingers. So that's kind of also a metaphor. But then it's also talking about winding about each other. And that is only something that humans do, right? We wrap ourselves around each other. So that is personification. And I think that's important. So it's entangled, right? This is what he sees outside. He's seeing this outside. But it also kind of gives the idea that the trees aren't also alone. And I really didn't write that in there. But he's standing alone outside as a human. And we don't last forever. But these trees have seemed to last forever. And they're never alone. They interlock their branches with each other. They form tunnels. They're just old and together. So, again, there was a lot in that. And you can take a lot of different things. You may not see the same things I see. That's what's great about English and reading. Each person is going to take their own meanings from it. I just ask that you convince me. All right. And so then once we're done, we're going to hashtag it. He, possibly car, because I still don't know if he's car, is outside in the cold. Right? I could even write, he's outside in the cold, surrounded by old trees. Whatever you need to kind of remember what's going on. And so see, I kind of went through these steps without really going through these, like, okay, 1, preview, 2, chunk. I can take those steps and start to get used to them and just kind of flow through. So again, we really still have some questions. We don't know if he's car. We don't know what he was avoiding. We don't even know why he's outside, right? So let's see what we can find out. So here's 2B, and it's a little bit shorter. And here's what I came up with. And notice, even though it's shorter, I have so many notes on it. And that is a good example of text. Sometimes a few lines can have so much meaning in them. And sometimes you can read a whole long text and you're like, I really didn't get much out of that. So it really just depends on the text and on your own prior experience. And a lot of these notes, I'm going to be very honest with you, came from my students from last year because they were really good at kind of breaking down text. So let's take a look. As you see, I have number 2 here because it's also 2B. So he felt the permanence of the street, of the town, the permanence of the trees. Okay, so first of all, most of my students did not know what permanence meant, but we're going to use some context clues. So here you see the question mark. I should have drawn an arrow over here as well. And it says question mark permanence. What does it mean? It sounds like permanent, and the trees are at least 100 years old, right? Because I knew that from the previous part of the text. So maybe permanence means long lasting, withstanding everything. So we can definitely take that to mean that. And it's also repetition because it says it twice. So the fact that it says it twice, it means it's really trying to drive home that the things that are surrounding him are permanent. Everything around him is old. And you see right here that I make that connection. So then when I also think about it, this makes me think, and this is called an inference, and I'm going to explain inferencing to you later, but it's kind of taking an educated guess, that he doesn't feel permanent. These things will be there long after he's gone. Now, let's think back to the title. I know if this person is Carr, he's going to have an early death. So that right there indicates that he is different from the trees. The trees will continue on. He will not. So that's just something to keep in your mind. The wind came up again and turned him, pushed him a half a step. So right there, that's personification, because the idea of being pushed, that's something that humans do to each other. So we can definitely think of it almost like a human just pushing him. And here's what it made me think about. I'm from Corpus, so it's really windy in Corpus. Especially when it gets in the wintertime, it gets really cold to me and really windy. So it makes me think of those cold, windy mornings where I could barely walk. It was too hard. I mean, it gets pretty windy in Corpus. And so that's kind of what it made me feel like. It's pushing him like a half step. Like he doesn't even have control of his own movements at this point. He looked away from the wind. So this tells me that he was actually facing the wind and it's hitting him. And I don't know if you've ever had that happen, but that's painful. If it's really windy, it kind of stings your face, especially if it's cold. So that kind of made me think about that. And so I wrote that connection. He is facing towards the wind, but then he turns his head. So he's trying to avoid that pain, that wind. The sky was brightening. Well, here I've underlined it because I think that's important, because that indicates to me that he was outside before the sun rose. So when I think about things that would take me outside before it's even bright, I think about work or school, right? There has to be some obligation. I'm not just going outside before the sun comes up just because I want to. The wind blew harder and harder. So again, here's repetition, harder and harder. So it's not a light wind. It's really trying to stress home that it's pounding him in the cold. And that often feels like needles. So it's not comfortable for him. He turned up his collar and sheltered against the house. Now I underlined sheltered because that indicates protection. He's trying to protect himself from the wind. He's trying to find safety. And this is where I draw from my own personal connections, kind of like the morning smells. When I think about somebody taking shelter from the wind, it honestly makes me think of you guys standing outside, huddled up when it's really cold. You guys will get here really early and you're kind of huddled together, trying to make sure the wind doesn't hit you because it's just cold. And so that's the image that came to my head. And so it says against the house. That means he's still near his home. And again, it really is kind of driving home to me that was probably converted into apartments. So it's probably one of those old houses that has lots of rooms, and each room is an apartment. And that's really common up north. So if I take the combination of cold and the way he's describing the trees, because that's something that they have up north, and then maybe this idea that the house is turned into apartments, I definitely feel that he's up north somewhere. It's probably in the east. But that's just my own inference. Okay, so what questions did I have? I still don't know what or who he's waiting for. And is he Carr? I think he's Carr. But that's just my guess based on what I've read. We're going to talk about tone later, but I put that the tone was cold or lonely. That's kind of like the mood, the feeling of it. And here is my hashtag. He realizes how old and permanent everything is as he stands in the cold and wind. So then now I can sit there and wonder, what is the author trying to tell me? And to me, I'm going to use a term that's probably new to you guys, but juxtaposition of Carr, who is probably going to die early, versus the outside trees that is permanent, okay? Now, juxtaposition means two very different things that are put side by side. So Carr's life is not going to be long, the trees are. It is also indicating that he's avoiding something, And there's just this whole running theme or sense of pain because he's avoiding something in the house. He doesn't want to be in his house, but then he also wishes the house and the doors turned into walls that didn't let people in. And then he's outside and he's being pushed around by this cold, bitter wind. So it's just this kind of sense of wanting to escape, but not wanting to escape. And I don't know about you, but Miss Garcia has felt that before. Maybe you guys came up with something different. I'd love to hear what you think about this short text, what ideas you came up with, because I would love to add them for next year. Definitely send me an email or a remind telling me if you think I'm way off base or if you think you agree with me, because I'd love to hear your opinions. But basically, that's what annotating is. It's taking the surface, the text, and just digging deep and making connections and seeing things that maybe you wouldn't have seen if you just read it once. So if you have any questions, let me know. I am going to create another one for the nonfiction piece, which is much shorter than this one. And again, remember that reading is something that you will take meaning from based on your own experiences. I will never tell you that you are wrong in those connections, but I will often tell you to convince me.